Welcome to Warring City-States. So we're going to return back to ancient Greece. When we left off, I know we took a break for elections, but when we left off, we had been talking about the legend of the Trojan War. We talked about the Trojan horse. We read a legend about that in class, and we looked at early people who influenced the Greeks, like Mycenaeans and Phoenicians and Minoans. But today we're going to look at the development of Greece into very strong, in many cases, city-states. And at some points during their early rise, these city-states were in conflict with one another. We're going to look carefully at the development of Athens and Sparta and how geography played a role in the development of each of those spaces. So you should write in your notebook, Roman numeral 2, warring city-states, and away we will go. So during the early Greek times, Mycenaeans, Minoans, and Phoenicians all had an influence on the particular area called Peloponnesus and the Greek peninsula in general. However, two things changed life there. First, the Mycenaeans and people like them began to identify less with the culture of their ancestors and more with the local area that they lived, their city-state. And then second, by the end of the period, the method of governing areas had changed from kind of a tribal and clan type control to more formal governments. Those governments were run by city-states. So we start to see a different way of power emerging in Greece. Away we go. By 750 BCE, the city-state or polis was the fundamental political unit of ancient Greece. A polis was made up of a city and its surrounding countryside. So polis is going to be an important vocab word. It's a city and the surrounding countryside, which includes numerous villages oftentimes. Most city-states controlled between 50 and 500 square miles of territory. They were often home to fewer than 10,000 residents. And some of the things that made the polis common, some of the commonalities between polises, I should say, were that they usually had an agora, which is a marketplace, an open space marketplace. And oftentimes there was an acropolis, a fortified hilltop where oftentimes the important government buildings were located. Greek city-states had many different forms of government. In some of them, a single person, like a king, ruled the government, and that was, of course, called a monarchy. But others adopted various other types of political structures. Some developed an aristocracy, which as a government ruled by a small group of noble people, usually land owning and of a particular family. These are very rich families that gained political power after serving maybe in a king's military cavalry or something like that. Later, as trade expanded, a new class of wealthy merchants and artisans emerged in some cities. When these groups became dissatisfied with aristocratic rule, they sometimes took power or shared it with the nobility, and they formed an oligarchy. An oligarchy is a government ruled by a few powerful people, but not necessarily like noble blood. Maybe this time the power comes from money. Of course, and famously, Athens develops a democracy, and in fact, the small population allowed for the democracy in Athens to be a direct democracy, which is not something that we practice in the United States. We practice a republic, and we'll talk about that later on. But in addition, there were time periods when tyrants would seize power. So in many city-states, repeated clashes occurred between rulers and the common people. Powerful individuals, usually nobles or other wealthy citizens, sometimes seized control of the government by appealing to the common people for support. These rulers were called tyrants, And unlike today, tyrants generally were not considered harsh or cruel, but rather they were looked upon favorably. They were usually leaders that would work for the interest of the ordinary people, and once in power, for example, tyrants often set up building programs to provide jobs or housing for their supporters. So here is the Acropolis of ancient Athens today. So we're going to hone in on two of these city-states and look at the development of their systems from the ground up, and talk about specifically in Athens, like what helped to build the democracy that we see. And then we'll look at Sparta because it's a stark contrast to Athens, just to give you a sense that in ancient Greece, from one city-state to the next, things could be extremely different, extremely different. The idea of representative government began to take root in some city-states, particularly in Athens. Like other city-states, Athens went through power struggles between the rich and the poor, but Athenians avoided major political upheavals by making reforms. Athenian reformers moved gradually toward democracy, which is rule by the people. In Athens, citizens participated directly in political decision-making. The first step toward democracy came when a nobleman named Draco took power. So what I'm going to talk about here are three people: Draco, Solon, and Cleisthenes. Okay? Draco, Solon, and Cleisthenes. Each of them did things that helped democracy become more democratic. It moved power away from the top and out toward the people. So watch for, like, what do each of them do to help that happen? In 621 BCE, Draco developed a legal code based on the idea that all Athenians, rich and poor, were equal under the law. Draco's code dealt very harshly with criminals, making death the punishment for almost every type of crime. It also upheld such practices as debt slavery, in which debtors worked as slaves to repay their debts. So the downside to Draco's legal code was that it was extremely harsh. In fact, sometimes when you read newspapers today, you'll see something referred to as draconian, and that means that it's like an eye for eye justice, or it's unusually harsh. The upside, though, was that it was equitable. It applied to everyone. So that's how it's its first step toward democracy. You have this really severe code, but it's applicable to everyone in Athenian society. More far-reaching democratic reforms were introduced by Solon, who came to power in 594 BCE. He said no citizen should be owning another citizen, and he outlawed the idea of debt slavery. So previous to this, if you were in debt to someone else, you were bonded to them until you paid that debt off. And sometimes you never paid that debt off. And so it ended up being the slavery. You were enslaved to another. So he says that's not the way we're going to handle things. He organized all Athenian citizens into 4 social classes according to wealth. Only members of the top 3 classes could hold political office. However, all citizens, regardless of class, could participate in Athenian assembly, which is where all the conversations were happening. Solon also introduced the legal concept that any citizen could bring charges against wrongdoers. So the idea of protections under the law get introduced in part by Solon. About 500 BCE, an Athenian leader named Cleisthenes came along. He introduced even further reforms. He broke up the power of the nobility by organizing citizens into 10 groups based on where they lived rather than their wealth. He also increased the power of the assembly by allowing all citizens to submit laws for debate and passage. He then created something called the Council of 500. This body proposed laws and counseled the assembly. The council members were chosen by lot or at random. So now you have like representatives in the political conversations that are happening at the Acropolis. And so for people who were needing to go to work every single day and couldn't participate, they knew they had at least a representative there. Okay? So Draco applies laws to all. Solon breaks people down into 4 different social groups, but he does, and that, I don't know, that does create an us versus them, but that already had been existing. He just was identifying it. And then he gets rid of debt slavery. And then Cleisthenes comes along and he says this council of 500 ought to be protecting people, and that people ought to be able to submit laws for passage. This is kind of like our initiative process. And that people ought to be able to participate through a representative. The reforms of Cleisthenes allowed Athenian citizens to participate in a limited democracy. However, citizenship was still limited. It was restricted to a relatively small number of Athenians, in fact. Only free adult male property owners born in Athens were considered citizens. Women and slaves and anybody that had come into Athens and wasn't born there was excluded from citizenship and had relatively few rights. For the most part, education was also not something that was allowed for people outside of that power structure. So for the most part, only the sons of really wealthy families received formal education. School began around the age of 7 and largely was bent on preparing boys to be good citizens. They studied reading and grammar, poetry, history, mathematics, and music, because citizens were expected to be able to have conversations in assembly. They were also receiving training in logic and public speaking. Since the Greeks believed that it was really important to train and develop the body, part of each day was also spent in athletic activities. And when they got older, the boys went to military school to help them prepare for another important duty of citizenship, which was defending Athens. Athenian girls didn't get to attend school. They were educated at home by their mothers and other female members of household. They learned about child rearing, weaving cloth, preparing meals, managing the household, and other skills that helped them become good wives and mothers. Some women were able to take their education a little bit further and learn to read and write. A few even became accomplished writers, but even so, most women had very little to do with Athenian life outside the boundaries of the home. Okay. Athens is here. And next we're going to go over to Sparta. So each of these different city-states was different from the other, but the contrast between Athens and Sparta is dramatic. And as a result, we're going to spend the next little bit on Sparta. So located in the southern part of Greece, known as the Peloponnesus, Sparta was almost nearly cut off from the rest of Greece by a gulf, the Gulf of Corinth, and also by a really rugged topography. In outlook and values, Sparta contrasted really sharply with the other city-states, Athens in particular. Instead of a democracy, Sparta built a military state. Around 725 BCE, Sparta conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and took over the land there. The Messenians became something called Helots. So the Spartans look to control more of the Peloponnesus. They come to control Messenia, and the Messenians, all the people there, get captured and conquered, and they become Helots. Helots are peasants. They're forced to stay on the land and work there. And each year, the Spartans demanded about half of the Helots' crops. In about 650 BCE, the Messenians were really being resentful over the Spartans' harsh rule, and they decided to put together a revolt. The Spartans, who were outnumbered by the Helots and the Messenians in general by about 8-1, just barely put down the revolt. And then, shocked at how vulnerable that they were, they decided to strengthen themselves. So the Helots were doing the work. They outnumbered the Spartans 8-1. And they decide they're going to rise up. The Spartans realize, wait a second, we're not strong enough for this. We just barely survived it, so now we're going to get serious. So the Spartan government has several branches: an assembly, which is composed of all the Spartan citizens, elected officials that voted on major issues. And there was something called the Council of Elders, which was made up of 30 older citizens that proposed laws on which the assembly in Sparta voted. 5 elected officials carried out the laws passed by the assembly, and these men also controlled education, prosecuted cases, and then on top of that, there were 2 kings that ruled over Sparta's military forces. The Spartan social order consisted of several groups. The first were citizens descended from the original inhabitants of the region. This group included the ruling families who owned the land. A second group that weren't citizens, but that were free, worked in commerce and industry. And then there were the Helots at the bottom of society. They were little better than slaves. They worked in the field or as house servants. From about 600 until about 371 BCE, Sparta had the most powerful army in Greece. However, the Spartan people paid a high price for their military supremacy. All forms of individual expression were discouraged, and as a result, Spartans didn't really value arts and literature and other artistic and intellectual pursuits. Spartans valued duty, strength, and discipline over freedom, individuality, and beauty, and learning. Since men were expected to serve in the army until the age of 60, their daily life centered on military training. Boys left home at around 7 years old and moved into army barracks, where they stayed until they reached the age of 30. They spent their days marching and exercising and fighting. They undertook these activities in all weather, wearing only light tunics and usually no shoes. At night, they slept without blankets on hard benches, and their diet consisted of little more than a bowl of coarse black porridge. Those who were not satisfied were encouraged to steal food. Such training produced tough, resourceful, clever soldiers. Spartan girls were also pretty hardy. They received some military training, and they ran and wrestled and played sports. And like boys, girls were taught to put service to Sparta above everything else, even the love of family. A legend says that Spartan women told their husbands and sons going to war, "Come back with your shield or on it." As adults, Spartan women had considerable freedom, especially in running the family estates when their husbands were off on active military service. Such freedoms surprised men from other Greek city-states. This was particularly true of Athens, where women were expected to remain out of sight and quietly raise their children. Okay, this is setting us up for something called the Persian Wars. And next time we get together, that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so you should know the difference between Athens and Sparta. Some of the stats that are in here, I'd expect you to know, like how early the boys go off to serve in the military in Sparta and how long they have to stay. Just so you know, some other additional information. They train. They go off and serve in the military as early as 7 and stay until 30, and they're not allowed to like live with their families until after they're 30 years old. Only then do they have families, and then they're still connected to the military, but they can actually live at home and with their families, but still with service to Sparta being the A number one expectation.